Hi there, I'm back and I'm madder than ever. Not really, I'm not mad at all. But I did leave YouTube about 2 months ago convinced that I may never come back. And I'm going to talk about today why I did that, why I am back, and what's going on with me. Hi there, I'm Linda Maxey, also known as Library Lynn, and soon to be known as LC Maxey, I hope. I left YouTube in March because I was exhausted. And I really didn't understand that that was what was going on with me. That was why I wanted to leave YouTube. At the time, I had been making a video a week for 15 months. And so that was over 60 videos that I had made in a pretty short period of time, which is not unusual for YouTubers, for booktubers. Some make more than that. But I had a lot of other things going on in my life at the time. So I had been making a lot of those videos, and my mother-in-law had passed away recently, and I was writing a novel, which I had just finished about the time that that video came out. I was beat, y'all. I couldn't think. My brain had completely quit working. For the last few months, I was making YouTube videos. I don't know if it showed or not, but I was so tired. I could not think of what I really wanted to say. I was having trouble coming up with topics for videos, and it finally hit me. I don't have to do this. This is not, I'm not trying to make a living on YouTube. I'm just doing this partly because I enjoyed it up until that point, and partly because it was a way to get some information about my books out there. So we're going to talk about all that today. Things look an awful lot different to me after a couple of months of rest. Okay, so the things I'm going to talk about today, first off, what I've been up to, what I've been reading, and finally, plans to change this channel somewhat. I'm going to go through a lot of books. I've been reading a lot in the past couple of months, so stay tuned to the end of the video and I'll let you know which one of these books I actually enjoyed the most. Okay, so what I've been up to. Number one, I've been up to writing. I finished writing my novel, The Robin's Nest, and I'll talk more about that in my next video. And I've been working with a very thorough editor who knows her stuff. She's noticed things about that novel that I never noticed. She's pointed out plot problems and all sorts of things that I just didn't see. I don't know how it works for most authors, but what I found for me, this is the way it works. I see what's happening in the novel in my head. I see it very plainly. But for somebody who doesn't have a space inside my head, who's not actually in here with me, they can't see what I'm seeing. So it was really interesting to me to have people read through the book and tell me, well, this didn't make sense to me, or I don't understand why that happened, because from my perspective with seeing it, it all made sense. So it's been a wonderful experience to work with her and the beta readers that I had worked with on this book. I actually worked with 4 beta readers, and they all had good information for me. And by beta reader, I just mean they read the book before it was actually ready, before I was ready to send it to the editor. Okay, so I've already explained one of the reasons why I hired an editor rather than relying on ProWriting8 or Grammarly or one of those other AI programs, although I do think they're very useful. I didn't use them for this novel. My editor is an ace at capturing all the pesky little details, like when to use quotes, M and N dashes, and things of that sort. If you ever write a book, it's super important to get a good editor. They're worth every dime that you pay them. Okay, the next thing I've been up to, and this is a biggie, is reading. I've been reading a lot. I mean, it was nice to just actually have time to sit down and relax and enjoy the reading. So I'm going to start first with the nonfiction books that I've been reading. First, I pointed this one out in my last video, and it is a hefty, hefty book. They Called Us White Chinese, The Story of a Lifetime of Service to God and Mankind by Robert N. Thorpe. Y'all, this was a fascinating book to read. There's a picture of Robert M. Thorpe. I hope you can see it, before he passed away. And this was taken in 1992, and he passed away in 1993. And this is his beloved wife, Eva, who joined up with him in China. They were both missionaries. They were the children of missionaries. They fell in love. and they wanted to serve as missionaries in China for the rest of their lives. Unfortunately, they were born at a time when that just wasn't possible. Robert Thorpe had lived in Manchuria, which is northern China, and that's where he took Eva after they got married. She had been brought up in southern China by her parents. And I'm going to put this book down because it's really heavy. They were in China when they first got married. The Japanese had invaded Manchuria. So when World War II broke out, they were arrested. They were British citizens, and Japan was at war with the British. So they were placed in prison, and eventually the Japanese sent them to America. They had a very circuitous route. They wound up living for a while in India. They had all sorts of adventures all over the planet. I mean, this is an amazing book. But once the war was over, they decided they wanted to go back to China and serve in his old hometown. But at that time, the communists under Mao had already started to take China over, and they were forced to flee against their will. They made their way to the United States, where Robert and Eva somewhat helped him. They did all sorts of things to make money. They were an amazing couple. But he was hired by the U.S. military to teach Mandarin Chinese to Air Force members. The book is almost 900 pages. It's got a lot of really good illustrations. It's a beautiful book, but it's a huge book, and each page has 2 columns of writing. So it took me almost 2 months to completely finish that book. It wasn't quite 2 months. It was very well written, and I enjoyed it, and I read other books while I was reading it. So it's not like I was just spending hours and hours a day on it, just a little time a day, and I got through it pretty quickly. So I recommend that book. It's a good one. It was given to me by one of his students, and the man that gave it to me was a member of the military, and he told me that the Thorpes had the students over to their house sometimes for dinner, and that Eva would make Chinese dumplings for them, and it was just fascinating. So that was a good experience. I would recommend this book to anyone who's interested in China, missionary work, languages, or life. It's not an overly religious book. He does, credit God with a lot of the miraculous things that happen in their lives, but it's not an overtly evangelical book. He's not trying to convert the people who read his story. So it was a really interesting book. And if you read it, you'll learn things that you would have a hard time learning any other way. Okay, the next book that I read, the next nonfiction book I read was Chesapeake Requiem, A Year with the Watermen of Vanishing Tangier Island. This is by Earl Swift. It's a long book, not nearly as long as that first one, but it's a long book. If you don't know, Tangier Island is off the coast of Virginia, and I'm from Virginia. That's one of the reasons I wanted to read this book. I have been to Tangier Island. It's been over 10 years ago, but I always wanted to go, and I did finally get to go. The island is in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay. And for hundreds of years, at least 300 years, it's been inhabited by people who... They have their own accent. I mean, it's not a Southern accent. People have compared it to Elizabethan English, which I've heard is not entirely accurate. And they are losing their accent now, unfortunately. When I was there, it was still obvious. I had 2 teenage girls walk up behind me while I was walking down the street, and it did sound almost foreign. Their accent was unlike anything I had ever heard, and those were local girls. But the island is sinking. He explains how with the ice ages, how the ice sheets had pushed the land north of the coastal plain of the mid-Atlantic states up. And ever since the ice has disappeared, that coastal plain has been sinking. And then you add to that sea rise, the island is rapidly disappearing. And even if it weren't, young people are no longer staying there because there's not much of a future for them there. So they're leaving. And it's a heartbreaking story in a lot of ways, but it was also fascinating because Earl Swift went and lived on the island with them for a year. And he got to know the locals, and he presents them as just people. He doesn't present them like museum exhibits that are just there to entertain the rest of us with their curious ways because, they've been so isolated for so long. They're real people, and they have real problems. Some of those problems are not pleasant, but in some ways they are delightful, and they do differ from people on the mainland. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, I really recommend the book. It is, especially towards the end, it was a little bit heartbreaking for me, but this is life. Life can be heartbreaking. So I highly recommend Chesapeake Requiem by Earl Swift. Now, I have been reading more fiction because I wasn't doing the YouTube channel, and I'm kind of getting away from the nonfiction a little bit because, you know, my focus on what I'm writing has switched. So I read a couple of really good fiction books. One was Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies, book 1 of the Emily Wilde series, a novel by Heather Fawcett. This was just an interesting book. You know, my book involves fairies in a used bookstore in a fictional mountain town in North Carolina. This is about a scholar who goes around Europe, and I guess maybe goes around the world, but in this book it was just Northern Europe, studying fairies. And she gets tangled up in with some. And, you know, in this book, fairies are not just folklore, they're actual beings. And she is a serious scholar in the 1900s, and she has help from her boyfriend. Although at the beginning of the novel, he's not her boyfriend, he is a colleague who just also happens to be a fairy. So if you're interested in fairies and that sort of thing, I recommend that book. Another one I read is Alexander McCall Smith's Dream Angus. You probably are familiar with him from the number 1 Ladies Detective Agency, about the detective who lives in Africa, I think Zimbabwe. It's been a while. It's been a long time since I've read the first one of those books, but it was delightful. And since I'm kind of into mythology and folklore and things like that, I decided to read Dream Angus, which is about the Celtic god of dreams. And the book itself is sort of like a dream. He goes back and forth between the story of Angus and modern fables with people who live in the not so distant past and today, and how Angus comes to them in dreams and helps their life. So it was a touching book. It's a very short book. You can read it very quickly, and I recommend it. I enjoyed it. I've also gotten into Cherokee Stories of the Little People and Fairies, and I've read 2 books on that. Cherokee Little People Were Real by Mary A. Joyce. This was researched and written in the early 2000s, late 1990s, early 2000s, and she went to, I think I'm saying it correctly, Callaway, North Carolina, which is out in the western part of the state, and it's where Western Carolina University is located. So there's a picture of the university, and she has marked here places where tunnels and artifacts were found when they built the university that probably, or could have, belonged to small beings that the Cherokee did talk about living in the area. They call the Little People. I'm not going to try to pronounce the Cherokee pronunciation because I would butcher it, but it's a heartbreaking book to me that all these artifacts were just bulldozed over. Nobody seemed to take them seriously. Some of them were taken out, they say, and taken to the University of Richmond. I haven't looked into that, but it's interesting. The lady who wrote this book was a journalist, and she's written several books on different topics, but she went into the area in like I said, about 25 years ago, and talked to people who actually had seen the tunnels and artifacts before they were destroyed or taken away. And she interviews a Cherokee lady. She just did some research into the area, and she doesn't present it as a story. She has interviews with people who actually experienced it. She just documented what they saw. The Secrets and Mysteries of the Cherokee Little People, and there again is the name of it. I'll put it on the screen so that you can see what the name is. But this was written by a husband and wife team, and they do talk somewhat. This is, as you can see, the language edition of this book. So they go into some of the pronunciations, how these things are said. But they also have just fabulous stories about the Cherokee people. And the wife was also an artist. She was an art teacher, and her illustrations are just absolutely gorgeous. Look at that. Maybe I'll put a few more of those up because they really are beautiful. But also, one of the very first stories in the book talks about this necklace I'm wearing. I don't know if you've noticed it, but this is called a fairy stone. And they talk about how the Cherokee story and how it involves the little people and how the fairy stones came to be. These are found naturally. This is, it's a mineral. Let me see if I can find the name of it. Starlite, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. But they come in all kinds of forms naturally. This is a Roman one, and it looks like a Christian cross. I'm from the area where these are from. I grew up very close to Ferrystone State Park, which is named for these stones because they can be found all over the place. I mean, they're getting harder to find, of course, because so many people have been out looking for them and gathered them up. But there are all sorts of shapes for them, and this is the Roman shape. And I'm just pleased as punch to have it, and I'm pleased as punch that the Cherokee actually had a story about it. They're found in the Blue Ridge Mountains of the eastern United States. And the final book I'm going to talk about that I've read is Story Genius by Lisa Cron, How to Use Brain Science to Go Beyond Outlining and Write a Riveting Novel. I wish I had studied and read this before I wrote my first novel because it's really helping me a lot with my second one. So it'll be interesting to see if the second one actually reads a whole lot better than my first one. I did a lot of research with my first one, and I took classes on how to write, and I really did my best, but I'm thinking that this is going to make a big difference. It's mainly just about how to plot your novel, but it's not one of these things where they just set out a certain set of beats and things like that you have to do. This is based on a certain overall scoping of the main character and their journey. So it's a wonderful book. I'm not quite finished with it yet, but I'm close to finished. I'm doing everything she recommends. So this would be a good book to read if you're interested in writing. I would recommend it. Okay, so that's what I've been reading, and that's what's been going on. Now I'm going to talk about my new plan for the channel. As I said in the last video, I was running out of ideas for videos by the time I got to that point. When I started that channel, my plan was to talk about nonfiction books that were recommended in my two books back there, Library Lens, Curated Collection of Superlative Nonfiction, and Library Lens, Biographies, Autobiographies, and Memoirs. In those books, I went through and found a bunch of books that were award winners or highly recommended, expert recommended books on different topics or on people. So I was trying to read as many books from those books as I could and talk about them in my videos. But y'all, I mean, you know, I enjoy reading nonfiction, but once I decided I wanted to read fiction, a lot of that lost its luster for me. I still recommend that for people who care about nonfiction or want to learn about the world, but I think it's time for me to move on to something else. I did think about making shorts to save time. You know, they're like a minute long or less, but when I started doing research into making shorts, it kind of stressed me out. It was like you have to gather people's, you have to grab people's attention, hook their attention within the first 2 seconds of the video. I can't think that way. I can't work that way. My brain does not work like that. I'm not snappy. And anyway, I just decided that wasn't for me. I couldn't do it. It would be more stressful. And I don't want to continue making a video every week. I don't have time for that. So what I've decided to do instead of making a video a week is just make one a month. That gives me a whole lot more time to work on my writing. The second thing I've decided is that I do want to finish my series on how to read a book, The Classic Guide to Intelligent Reading by Mortimer J. Adler and Charles Van Doren. So I'm almost halfway through with that book, and I am going to finish that. My next video is going to be about my new novel coming out, but after that I'm going to start back on how to read a book, and I think the next chapter is on aids to reading, so like reference sources and things like that you can use to help you with your reading. And other than that, I think I'm going to base this channel for the most part on my fiction books. I don't mean I'm just going to talk about my fiction books. I mean, I do a lot of research. I don't just come up with all this stuff right out of my head. So I'm going to talk about my research, and I'm going to talk about the books that I read that are similar to the books that I'm writing or that provide inspiration and fuel for my writing. And I hope that'll be interesting to you too. So here's some of the topics that'll be covered: plant and bird folklore books and just books about plants and birds in general, books on writing, videos on my writing process, my struggles and my solutions. I'm not an expert, y'all. This would be, you working with somebody who's trying to teach yourself how to do this stuff. Fairy tale books that I've read or am trying to track down, because I am trying to track down some older books that are hard to find now. Folklore books of all sorts, books on Appalachian mountain life, the history and culture of this area, because I love this area. This is where I'm from. This is my heritage. And books on aging in a culture that worships youth, because I'm not getting any younger, and I'm going to spend some time talking about that. And finally, talking about women's fiction, the genre itself. I'm writing in paranormal women's fiction, but it has a lot in common with just regular reality-based women's fiction, and I'm going to talk about that. Generally, the difference between that women's fiction and romance is romance deals with love, of course, romantic love, that's what hangs in the balance. But with women's fiction, it's enlightenment. So that leads into spiritual topics, and I'm going to talk about spiritual topics and books that I read to help me find my way in that area as well. So I'm hoping it'll be fun, and I hope you'll join me on my journey going forward. The books and topics I cover will be a mix of fiction and nonfiction, but I'm not going to put pressure on myself to read tons of books and keep up with booktubers. That's not my focus, and I'm not going to try to be like an author tuber and tell you how to write, because I don't feel qualified to do that, and it's not where my interests lie. So this channel is going to be a real mixed bag, and if that sounds good to you, fantastic. If you have other ideas that might work for my channel, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear what you think. And as promised, here's the book that I enjoyed reading the most. Chesapeake Requiem of all those books was the one that I actually enjoyed reading the most. I could not put this book down. It was fascinating to me. What's the best book you've read over the last 2 months? I'd like to know. Leave a comment. And until next time, happy reading.